All right, good evening. Thanks to those of you who are joining live and those of you who are watching the recording. I appreciate it. My name is Dr. Josh Franco, Assistant Professor of Political Science at Cuyamaca College in East San Diego County, California. Welcome to our workshop on global conflict and cooperation. Just jump right in. So this workshop is a series that's focused on defining, exploring, and discussing global conflict and cooperation from the point of view of different international institutions, country governments, and international non-governmental organizations. Our schedule for summer of 2022 began with Summit of the Americas last week. Today we'll be discussing Ukraine, and the following weeks are to be determined. I haven't decided which topics or countries or international institutions. So if you have ideas, feel free to send them along. I'm happy to explore them in depth with you. But today we'll certainly be talking about Ukraine. So let me go ahead and jump to that slide there. So Ukraine. First, I just want to point out where Ukraine actually is, which is in central, I would say Eastern Europe, Western Asia, and more generally, Western Central, or I said Central Asia, but it's kind of hard. So I want to draw a picture here. Here's Ukraine. Here are the Eastern European countries. Here's Russia chilling over here. Here's the strategic Black Sea. And then countries like Bulgaria, Georgia, Serbia, and then Italy, and so on. So Ukraine is central to this part of the world. And as you are very familiar with, it is in conflict because it's been invaded by Russia about almost 4 months ago now. So let's explore this in depth. Our learning objectives with this workshop are the following: is first to identify where Ukraine is located. Secondly is to explain a real-world example of conflict. Third is to explain a real-world example of cooperation. And then finally, describe the implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So a little bit about Ukraine. Here's a map of the country. The capital is Kiev. We know that most of the invasion from Russian forces have been in this region, or I would say the eastern parts of Ukraine. There have been rocket attacks that have reached parts of Western Ukraine. And I just want to highlight here that Belarus is to the north. Obviously, Russia is to the north and to the east. Romania, Moldova, Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland. And then once you start heading this way, greater Europe. So we'll see a map showing this conflict over time, among other things. I do want to show the CIA World Factbook webpage for the country of Ukraine. I'll go ahead and post a link in the chat so you can check that out at your leisure. So the CIA has maintained this World Factbook for as long as I can remember, 10, 20 plus years now. And they give a lot of background and information about countries and the like. So what I'd like to do is go ahead and read, or have the computer read to us, these last two paragraphs to kind of bring us up to speed about where we're at thus far. So let me go ahead and read this section out loud.
Shortly after Yanukovych's departure in late February 2014, Russian President Putin ordered the invasion of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula, falsely claiming the action was to protect ethnic Russians living there. 2 weeks later, a referendum was held regarding the integration of Crimea into the Russian Federation. The referendum was condemned as illegitimate by the Ukrainian government, the EU, the US, and the UN General Assembly (UNGA). In response to Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, 100 members of the Union passed UNGA Resolution 68/262, rejecting the referendum as baseless and invalid and confirming the sovereignty, political independence, unity, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. In mid-2014, Russia began supplying proxies in 2 of Ukraine's eastern provinces with manpower, funding, and materiel, driving an armed conflict with the Ukrainian government that continues to this day. Representatives from Ukraine, Russia, and the unrecognized Russian proxy republics signed the Minsk Protocol and Memorandum in September 2014 to end the conflict. However, this agreement failed to stop the fighting or find a political solution. In a renewed attempt to alleviate ongoing clashes, leaders of Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany negotiated a follow-on package of measures in February 2015 to implement the Minsk agreements. Representatives from Ukraine, Russia, the unrecognized Russian proxy republics, and the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe also meet regularly to facilitate implementation of the peace deal. By early 2022, more than 14,000 civilians were killed or wounded as a result of the Russian intervention in eastern Ukraine. On February 24, 2022, Russia escalated its conflict with Ukraine by invading the country on several fronts, in what has become the largest conventional military attack on a sovereign state in Europe since World War II. The invasion has received near universal international condemnation, and many countries have imposed sanctions on Russia and also supplied humanitarian and military aid to Ukraine. The invasion has also created Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II. As of June 14, approximately 7.57 million people had fled Ukraine, and more than 7.13 million people were internally displaced as of May 30. More than 9,930 civilian casualties had been reported as of June 12.
So this brings us up to speed with what's happening in Ukraine. And I just want to highlight two important things here, among others. The first one is that this is the largest conventional military attack on a sovereign state in Europe since World War II. I just think about that for a second, right? World War II, global conflict, Axis versus Allies, massive destruction around the world, particularly in parts of Europe. And we know the impact of war, and that region and the people of Europe know the impact of war very intimately because of the magnitude and the proximity and the immediacy of the European and theater battles versus in World War II. So that was in the 40s, 1940s. Fast forward to 2022, and here we are again, right? This devastating conflict being waged against the country of Ukraine by the country of Russia. It's pretty spectacular in the broadest sense. Secondly is the displacement of people, right? Any war has human cost and human sacrifice. And while we might want to focus on the soldiers waging the battle, we should think about also the people who, what we call internally displaced, who have to leave their homes, their villages, their towns, their cities, and find somewhere else to live. And at least to the latest estimates, about a week ago, 7.5 million people have left the country, and more than 7.1 million people were internally displaced. That's a lot of people. We're not talking like 5 or 10 or 15, 20, 30 people. Like, we're talking millions and millions and millions of people, right? Whose lives are being upended by this conflict. So this is part of the magnitude of what we're seeing in Ukraine today. So next, conflict. So I had a workshop about Ukraine before the conflict, before the invasion by the Russian government. So we talked about things in 2014 and in 2021. And I like to bring us up to speed by going to Wikipedia, which has maintained a day by day, hour by hour assessment of what's been going on in this invasion. So I'm going to go ahead and play. Actually, I'll just read this out loud. So on February 24th, 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine in a major escalation of the Russo-Ukrainian war that began in 2014. The invasion caused Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II, with more than 7.7 million Ukrainians fleeing the country and a third of the population displaced. The invasion has also caused global food shortages. Let me jump to the third paragraph. The invasion began on the morning of 24th of February when Putin announced a special military operation to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. Minutes later, missiles and airstrikes hit across the country, including the capital, Kiev. A large ground invasion followed from multiple directions. Zelensky, who is the president of Ukraine, enacted martial law and a general mobilization of all male Ukrainian citizens between 18 to 60, who were banned from leaving the country. At the start of the invasion, Russian attacks were launched on a northern front from Belarus towards Kiev, a northeastern front towards Kharkiv, a southern front from Crimea, and a southeastern front from the cities of Luhansk and Donetsk. During March, the Russian advance towards Kiev stalled. Amidst heavy losses and strong Ukrainian resistance, Russian troops retreated from Kiev Oblast by the 3rd of April. On the 19th of April, Russia launched a renewed attack across 500 kilometers or 300-mile-long front extending from Kharkiv to Donetsk to Luhansk. This with simultaneous missile attacks directed at Kiev in the north and Lviv in the Western Ukraine. This Wikipedia page, which I'll post a link in the chat, goes on to go into incredible detail about a conflict. We have not seen this level of detail about any conflict. And I want to point out that when we think about conflict, we kind of always think about it in the what we call the fog of war. Like we don't know what's going on, but we know the buildup to this conflict was actually well publicized by none other than the U.S. government. The U.S. government would release classified information, satellite images, and other things to give the world a very clear picture about what was expected to happen in Ukraine by the Russian government. And then when it did happen, this February 24th attack, everyone knew. It wasn't a shock or a surprise. It was like, okay, well, they're building up armaments. They are building military hospitals. They are moving blood supplies. Like, you only do this if you are anticipating a conflict. So the weeks, the months leading up to the Russian government's invasion of Ukraine were well documented by classified and other intelligence being publicly available. So now that the conflict is ongoing for the past 3 or 4 months, there's people have cell phones, people have email, people have the internet. The President Zelensky's, is going on TV, YouTubing into or zooming into conferences of global leaders. The Russian government's having their events publicized. So we're having a very clear documentation of this conflict, minute by minute, hour by hour, day by day, week by week, month by month. So part of this documentation allows us to kind of lift the hood or move away the fog of war and really see not just in general like the tactics and the movement of military personnel, but the human toll and the human cost. So when we think of conflict, this is the first time where we're seeing a large-scale military intervention in it. I would say in a largely industrialized or well-connected country like Ukraine, and it's being documented. So this conflict, its actual costs, its human costs, its economic costs, its military costs are all being added up. Next, I'd like to show this image, which has already started to play. This is available on the wiki page. So it shows the Russian invasion of Ukraine, phase 1 from the 24th of February to the 7th of April. So what you're seeing is snapshots of the country of Ukraine in yellow, occupied parts of it in red, Russian and separatist advances in red arrows. Blue arrows are Ukrainian advances. These little explosions, which are hard to see, but they're there, are air and ground bombardments. And then we see just this movement overall. So we're going to let it run through April 7th, and we'll kind of do a play-by-play once it starts back over. So February, we see 4th, and then massive attacks in red moving forward. We see some movement, but it's kind of like slows to a crawl. And there's not much advance being made by the Russian government. Then we see some more slots moving along in late March. So about a month into the conflict. And then we start to see these counteroffensives by the Ukrainian forces up until the point where they seem to push them back. So this just demonstrates like you don't get this level of detail unless you're a military commander, right? But because it's all happening in the 21st century with like all this information available, this is being documented. So this is one of the more, I would say, spectacular pieces of information that are being available to us. Not just one attack or two attacks or one explosion causing devastation to a community or family, but we're seeing all these big moves, small moves being displayed to us for the world to see. So with respect to cooperation, so in the past workshop, we talked about how the EU was looking to help Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine improve its defense capabilities. We saw that the EU was approving millions of dollars in security aid to Ukraine. This was pre-Russian government invasion. So post-invasion, we can look at first the U.S. security cooperation with Ukraine. So I'm going to pull up the U.S. State Department's website and webpage dedicated to this topic, and I'm going to post a link in the chat so you can check it out. So I'm gonna go ahead and play, I think, this first parts. Let me just change the voice options here. I always kind of go to different voices. Okay.
The United States, our allies, and our partners worldwide are united in support of Ukraine in response to Russia's premeditated, unprovoked, and unjustified war against Ukraine. We have not forgotten Russia's earlier aggression in eastern Ukraine and occupation following its unlawful seizure of Crimea in 2014. The United States reaffirms its unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders, extending to its territorial waters. Ukraine is a key regional strategic partner that has undertaken significant efforts to modernize its military and increase its interoperability with NATO. It remains an urgent security assistance priority to provide Ukraine the equipment it needs to defend itself against Russia's war against Ukraine. Since January 2021, the United States has invested more than $6.3 billion in security assistance to demonstrate our enduring and steadfast commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. This includes more than $5.6 billion since Russia's launched its premeditated, unprovoked, and brutal war against Ukraine on February 24. Since 2014, the United States has provided more than $8.3 billion in security assistance for training and equipment to help Ukraine preserve its territorial integrity, secure its borders, and improve interoperability with NATO. United States security assistance committed to Ukraine includes over 1,400 Stinger anti-aircraft systems, over 6,500 Javelin anti-armor systems, over 20,000 other anti-armor systems, over 700 Switchblade tactical unmanned aerial systems, 108 155mm howitzers and over 220,000 155mm artillery rounds, 90 tactical vehicles to tow 155mm howitzers.
So the list goes on. Like, we're not talking stones and pebbles and slings. We're talking like heavy duty military equipment, right? We're talking armored personnel carriers, laser guided rocket systems, air surveillance radars. Like, just the magnitude. I'm like over here, like, just the magnitude of this all, billions and billions of dollars to be able to support the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian military in a counter-offensive and in defensive positions to protect its territorial integrity and sovereignty. And so this webpage goes on to detail things like security assistance, excess defense articles, third-party transfers, foreign military sales, and the like. Now, just think about that for a second. All this information is publicly available. It's on the State Department's website. The US government ain't trying to hide what it's doing in Ukraine or for Ukraine or with Ukraine or what it's sending over there. Now, we could speculate, well, maybe this isn't the complete picture. Maybe there are other things, like maybe the numbers aren't correct. Like, it's not 1,400 Stinger aircraft, it's double that. But let's just accept this as fact and as true. Here you go, public. This is what we're doing. No qualms about it. Right. So this, when you think about as an act of cooperation, it isn't just sending the actual armaments and resources to the Ukrainian government and military. It's telling the world, those who are opposed to these efforts and those who are supportive and those who are on the fence, to say, wow, the United States is making a significant cooperative commitment to support the country of Ukraine. Now, in addition to what the US is doing, let's look at what the European Union is doing. So let's click on their website, EU Solidarity with Ukraine. So I'll read this. The EU and its international partners are united in condemning Putin's aggression on Ukraine. We will provide support to those seeking shelter, and we will help those looking for a safe way home. The EU will continue to offer strong political, financial, and humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and impose hard-hitting sanctions against Russia and those complicit in this war. You can also read this information in different languages. So they have, if you're coming from Ukraine, here's your rights. If you are based in the EU, how can you help people in Ukraine? Actions that are being taken, how the EU is working together, what assistance being provided, how the EU is welcoming those fleeing Ukraine, and EU sanctions. So I'm going to use sanctions as an example of cooperation, but how that cooperation can be viewed, obviously, from a different perspective as conflictual. So EU sanctions. You first might be asking, what's a sanction? It's basically a tool used by governments to make it more difficult for another country and its government to be able to take actions on things or to be able to engage in the economic transactions and trades, to be able to engage in the financial markets and banking systems, to be able to make it difficult to export goods and services to other parts of the world. So let's go ahead and have this paragraph read to us here.
In response to Russian President Putin's unprecedented and unprovoked military attack against Ukraine, the EU is responding by adopting a comprehensive and robust package of restrictive sanctions designed to cripple the Kremlin's ability to finance the war, impose clear economic and political costs on Russia's political elite responsible for invasion, and diminish its economic base.
So clear and succinct. Now, if you want to get into more details about what's going on, the EU has that on their website. Prohibition to provide individual listings of people and entities. Prohibition to provide funds or economic resources to people. So travel bans, asset freezes, prohibition to provide funds, entities, asset freeze, prohibition to provide funds. How many people? Over 1,100. How many entities? 98. What are some of the financial and business services? They go on to explain things about what these sanctions include. For example, prohibiting any form of lending to buying of securities issued by certain Russian banks and government, including the central bank. Imposing asset freezes and financing bans on a number of Russian banks, and so on. Energy sector. Banning exports of specific refining technologies. A far-reaching ban on new investments. This is all public. They're not, the EU is not hiding what it's trying to do. Go down the list. And this is why this is so spectacular, because the amount of information that's being provided by democracies or representative governments on how it is cooperating with the country of Ukraine, but at the same time engaging in conflict with the country and the government of Russia is just mind-boggling. How we're seeing a war in the 21st century with the internet as what it is today, and how quickly information is provided, and how all of this is just being made very clear and plain to not just countries around the world and their governments, but to the people and to the publics, for them to make their own assessments and to develop their own conclusions. So examples of cooperation from Ukraine's perspective, absolutely. From the Russian government's perspective, obviously this is viewed as conflict. So lastly, what are some of the implications? Well, pre-invasion, we talked about how President Zelensky was meeting with Pentagon officials, such as Secretary Austin, how the Ukrainian Prime Minister was calling for NATO's help against Russia. This was before the invasion. And now what are some of the implications? So it's been about 100 plus days since Russians invaded. Well, first is now Ukraine, that conflict is motivating the countries of Finland and Sweden to consider joining NATO. Now, you might be asking, what's NATO? Well, NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's a defensive pact of mostly European countries and the US against at the time, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, and now the Russian Federation. And Finland and Sweden have been very middle of the road, neutral. But because of this Russian invasion of Ukraine, those two countries are saying, you know what? I think it's time for us to join this NATO defensive pact. That's a big deal because they've been on the fence for decades. Next is Ukraine moves one step closer to EU membership. So what's the EU? Well, the EU is the European Union. It is an economic, political entity that is basically a loose federation of all the country governments in Europe. And they've been working towards that since the end of World War II, so the 1940s, 50s. And Ukraine has not been a member of it. When you're not a member, you don't share the currency, the euro. You don't have eases on trade and travel and immigration. You don't allow for kind of fluid banking and other activities. But now EU is saying, Ukraine, we think we want you to become a member. So I'm going to go ahead and open up this page and have this read to us, and then we'll go ahead and get to our discussion. So conflict, cooperation, and the implications or the impacts. So let's go ahead and have this read to us here.
The European Commission has backed Ukraine's bid to be given candidacy status to join the EU, bringing it one step closer to joining the bloc. Good work has been done by Ukraine, but more is needed, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said. Ukraine must make important reforms on rule of law, oligarchs, human rights, and tackling corruption, she added. Candidacy status is a significant step to joining the EU. However, the whole process can take many years. The recommendation from the European Commission still needs to be signed off by the EU's 27 member states, who meet to discuss it next week. The French, German, and Italian leaders have already backed Ukraine's bid, but the decision must be unanimous. Speaking from Brussels and wearing blue and yellow, the colors of Ukraine, Ms. von der Leyen said Ukrainians were ready to die for the European perspective. We want them to live with us in the European dream, she said, adding that Ukraine had shown its aspiration and determination to live up to European values and standards. But it is conditional. Ukraine has work to do, she said, to ensure international law is respected. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky tweeted that the historic decision would bring victory closer.
So I want to highlight two things here. The first one is that even giving candidacy status is a big deal because it then begins this longer term process of basically having the entering country make reforms and demonstrating those reforms, while the EU is assessing and evaluating those and determining how they can best bring in this new partner into the union. The second one is how it was framed as basically saying if the EU is willing to fight the Russian Federation or the Russian government in its unprovoked attack and essentially defending or being the defensive country by which Europe is protected, then the EU should recognize that. And they should value that and should honor that. And they should welcome the Ukrainian peoples and government into the EU fold. So this article goes on to describe some of these dynamics. And basically, this is a major implication from the Russian invasion that the EU saying, we want to bring you into our fold, Ukraine. So with that, a lot of different moving parts. This is one of the first times, the only time really, where I talked about a country before a war, and now we're talking about the country as the war is going on. So we'll explore this in more details. We'll get to our discussion. And with that, I want to thank you for taking the time to listen in. So with that, we'll go ahead and stop the recording and have a great night.